because she didn't even say hello. She just launched right into telling me not to come to the funeral. I actually laughed at first, because I thought she was joking, like some kind of weird grief response. But then she got louder and explained that I would be embarrassing the family. All of Grandma's friends are doctors and lawyers and successful people. And what was she supposed to tell them when they asked what I do? That her 28-year-old son delivers pizza and can't even afford his own place. I sat there in my car with my phone pressed to my ear, trying to understand what was happening. This was my grandmother's funeral, the woman who raised my mom, and I was being uninvited because of my job. Before I could even respond, Dad grabbed the phone. He informed me that they'd already told everyone I was working overseas in international consulting. It was less embarrassing than the truth. He said those exact words. Less embarrassing than the truth. My brother Declan got on the phone next. He's 31 and works in finance, engaged to a woman named Piper, whose family apparently has money. He explained that Piper's parents would be at the funeral, and they think our family has class. Me showing up in my work uniform would ruin that impression. I wasn't even planning to wear my uniform, but apparently the assumption was that I'm too stupid to own regular clothes. My sister's area, who's 26 and works in marketing, added that they'd already picked a replacement pallbearer. Our cousin Russell has a real job. She said, "A real job? Like what I do isn't real work." Then Mom got back on the phone and made an offer. She said they'd acknowledge I exist if I paid for the entire funeral, $22,000. Otherwise, stay away. Dad added that they needed $18,000 for the headstone, too, and I had 24 hours to decide. I told them that was impossible. I had maybe $4,000 in savings. They all laughed. Mom brought up how our cousin Morgan just bought her second house, and I can't even buy a used car without it breaking down, which was a reference to my Camry needing a new transmission last year, something I'd mentioned in passing at Christmas. Before Dad hung up, he told me they'd packed up my childhood room and donated everything to Goodwill. My old books, my high school yearbooks, photos, everything. It was all gone. Then the call ended. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes trying to figure out what had just happened. My family had disinvited me from my own grandmother's funeral because they were ashamed of my job. They'd been lying about me for years. And now they wanted me to pay $40,000 for the privilege of being acknowledged as their son. The thing is, I wasn't even that surprised. I'd known for years that they looked down on me. Every family gathering involved pointed questions about when I was going back to school, when I was going to get a real career, why I was wasting my potential. My dad once introduced me to his golf buddy as his daughter's brother, completely skipping over the fact that I'm his son. Declan got a new BMW for his 25th birthday. I got a gift card to a restaurant for mine. And Mom made a comment about how at least I could get one nice meal. But this was different. This was my grandmother's funeral, and they were erasing me from it. I went back to work and finished my shift because what else was I going to do? I delivered pizzas to college kids and families and tried not to think about the fact that my own family considered me so worthless that they'd rather pretend I didn't exist than admit what I do for a living. That night, I started making calls. I needed to understand the full scope of this situation. I called my Aunt Carrie, my mom's sister. She confirmed that, yes, everyone in the family had been told not to tell me about funeral arrangements. She sounded uncomfortable, but said she understood why my parents made this choice. The optics, she said. The optics of having a pizza delivery driver at a funeral. I called my cousin Russell, the one who was replacing me as pallbearer. He at least had the decency to sound guilty. He told me that Declan had asked him 3 days ago, before Grandma even died. They'd been planning this. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in grief. They'd discussed it, decided I was too much of an embarrassment and made arrangements to exclude me. Here's what really got me, though. I called the funeral home to ask about costs. The total for everything, including the headstone, was $12,000, not $40,000. My parents had tried to extort me for more than 3 times the actual cost, probably figuring I'd never check. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about Grandma and how she'd asked me about my job without judgment, how she'd seemed genuinely interested in the stories I told about customers and coworkers. And now I couldn't even say goodbye to her because my family had decided I wasn't good enough. Saturday came and I had a choice to make. I could show up anyway and cause a scene. I could pay what I had and try to negotiate, or I could do something else entirely. I'd been working as a delivery driver for 6 years. Before that, I'd done 2 years of college before dropping out because I hated it and was drowning in debt. My parents had never forgiven me for that. In their minds, I'd thrown away my future. But here's what they didn't know. I'd been saving money. I'd been planning, and I'd been building something. See, 3 years ago, I started doing food delivery on top of my pizza job. Apps, multiple platforms, working 70-hour weeks. I saved everything I could. Last year, I'd started investing in cryptocurrency and got lucky with a few picks. Nothing crazy, but enough that my savings weren't just the $4,000 they assumed I had. I had options. I'd always had options. I just let them think I was broke and struggling because it was easier than dealing with their judgment if they knew I was actually doing okay. Sunday morning, 16 hours before the funeral, I made my decision. I wasn't going to give them money. I wasn't going to show up and make a scene. I was going to do something they'd never expect. I was going to make them come to me. At 2 a.m. Monday morning, all 4 of them were outside my apartment building screaming my name. Okay, so the comments on my last post at Trust Test Hub were wild. Some of you guessed what I did. Most of you were way off. And a few of you told me I should just let it go and move on. To those people, respectfully, no. You don't get to uninvite someone from their grandmother's funeral and then face 0 consequences. Let me back up to Sunday afternoon, about 18 hours before they showed up outside my apartment screaming. After that phone call on Friday, I spent Saturday doing research. I called the funeral home, like I mentioned, and confirmed the actual cost. $12,000, not $40,000. Then I started thinking about why they'd lied about the price, and it clicked. They needed money, not wanted. Needed. See, here's what I knew about my family's finances that they didn't realize I knew. 2 years ago at Thanksgiving, I overheard Dad on the phone in the garage. He was talking to someone about refinancing the house. He sounded stressed. Then last Christmas, Declan mentioned that he'd loaned Mom and Dad money for some repairs. He said it quietly to Zaria, but I was in the next room putting dishes away. My parents have always lived above their means. Country club membership they couldn't afford, new cars every 3 years, vacations they'd post all over social media. But I'd never really thought about the money side of it, because they made sure to constantly remind me how successful they were compared to their failure son. So Sunday morning, I did something simple. I called my parents' mortgage company. I pretended to be Dad and said I needed to verify the account details for a refinance. The customer service rep wouldn't give me everything, but she did confirm that yes, there was an account under that name and address. Then I called their country club, asked if they were still taking new members and what the monthly dues were. $800 a month. I wasn't trying to steal their identity or do anything illegal. I was just confirming what I suspected. They were overextended. The $40,000 shakedown wasn't just cruelty. They actually needed money and figured they could guilt me into paying while also keeping me away from the funeral. Then I made my move. I called every single person I could think of who was planning to attend Grandma's funeral. Aunt Carrie, Uncle Ralph, cousins, family friends, people from Grandma's church. I told each of them the same thing. I'd been uninvited from my own grandmother's funeral because my parents were ashamed of my job, and they were telling people I worked overseas to avoid embarrassment. I didn't lie. I didn't exaggerate. I just told them exactly what happened, including the part where my parents tried to extort $40,000 from me for funeral costs that were actually $12,000. Most people were shocked. A few tried to stay neutral, but by Sunday evening, my phone was buzzing with messages. Family members were calling my parents, asking if it was true. Church ladies were leaving voicemails. The gossip network that my parents had tried so hard to control was now working against them. Then I did the thing that really set them off. I posted on social media. Nothing dramatic, just a simple post. Heartbroken that I won't be able to attend my grandmother's funeral tomorrow due to family circumstances. She was an amazing woman who never judged anyone for their job or life choices. I'll miss you, Grandma. I didn't mention my parents directly. I didn't have to. Within an hour, people were commenting, asking what happened. Family members who'd heard the story started dropping hints. Someone posted a crying emoji and said something about how sad it was when families value appearances over love. My parents' carefully constructed image was falling apart in real time. The funeral was scheduled for 10 a.m. Monday. At 11 p.m. Sunday night, my phone started ringing. Mom first, then Dad, then Declan. I didn't answer. I let every call go to voicemail. I wanted them to sit with what they'd done. At midnight, the voicemails started getting frantic. Mom was crying, saying I was ruining everything. Dad was angry, demanding I take down my social media post and stop telling people lies. Declan left a message saying I was being immature and petty, that I was making everything about me when it should be about Grandma. At 1 a.m., Zaria sent me a series of texts. She said people were calling them nonstop. Church members, family, friends, even some of Grandma's neighbors. Everyone wanted to know why they'd uninvited me. Some people were threatening not to come to the funeral at all. The whole thing was turning into a disaster. At 1:30 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Just my address and the words, "We're coming over." I live on the 3rd floor of a building with a security entrance. You need a code or a resident to buzz you in. I sat in my apartment wondering if they'd actually show up. And at 2 a.m. I heard it, screaming from outside. I looked out my window, and all 4 of them were standing in the parking lot. Mom was yelling my name. Dad was pacing back and forth. Declan had his phone out, like he was trying to call me again. Zaria just stood there with her arms crossed. My roommate Ralph came out of his room, asking what was going on. I told him it was my family, and I didn't yell back. I just looked down at them and said I had nothing to say to people who uninvited me from my own grandmother's funeral. Then I closed the window. That made it worse. Mom started crying louder. Dad was shouting about disrespect. Someone from another apartment yelled at them to shut up. Another neighbor threatened to call the cops. Finally, around 2:45 a.m. they left. But the texts didn't stop. All 4 of them were messaging me. And now other family members were getting involved, too. Aunt Carrie sent me a long message about how I was tearing the family apart. Cousin Russell said I should have just stayed quiet. I went to bed at 3 a.m. and woke up at 6 to 73 text messages and 14 missed calls. The funeral was in 4 hours, and I had to decide what to do next. Part of me wanted to show up anyway. Part of me wanted to let them suffer through it, knowing everyone was talking about them. Part of me just wanted to go back to sleep and forget any of this ever happened. But here's what I couldn't stop thinking about. They still didn't apologize. Not once in all those voicemails and texts did anyone say they were sorry for what they'd done. They were only upset because they got caught. They were only panicking because their image was ruined. At 7 a.m., Mom called again. This time I answered. She immediately started talking about how I needed to fix this, how I needed to tell everyone it was a misunderstanding, how I was embarrassing them. I let her talk for about 3 minutes straight before I said anything. Then I asked her one question. "Are you ashamed of me?" She got quiet. Then she said it wasn't about shame. It was about presentation, about what people think, about maintaining certain standards. She said, "When you come from a good family, you have responsibilities to uphold that image." I told her, "I deliver pizza. That's what I do. And if that's too embarrassing for her, then she doesn't actually have a son." She started crying again and handed the phone to Dad. He wasn't crying. He was angry. He told me I'd better fix this mess I'd created, or there would be consequences. I asked what kind of consequences. He said they'd cut me off, completely. I'd never be welcome in their home again. They'd tell the whole family I was unstable. I almost laughed. They'd already cut me off. They'd already uninvited me from the funeral. What exactly did they think they could take away that they hadn't already tried to take? I told Dad I'd see him at the funeral and hung up. At 9:30 a.m., I got dressed in the only suit I own. It's not expensive, but it's clean and it fits. I drove to the funeral home and parked in the back lot. I could see people arriving. Family members, church friends, Grandma's Bridge Club ladies. I watched my parents pull up in their Lexus. Declan and Piper arrived in his BMW. Zaria came with some guy I'd never seen before. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching everyone go inside. Then I got out and walked to the entrance. That's when things got really complicated. So yeah, I went. After everything they'd done. After the 2 a.m. screaming session. After being explicitly told to stay away, I showed up to my grandmother's funeral. The comments on my last update at Trust Test Hub were split. Half of you said I should go and hold my head high. The other half said showing up would just cause more drama and I should let them suffer without me. To be honest, I didn't decide until I was already sitting in that parking lot, watching everyone go inside. But here's what pushed me over the edge. This was my grandmother, the one person in that family who treated me like I mattered, and they didn't get to take that goodbye away from me just because they were ashamed of my job. I walked up to the entrance at exactly 9:55 a.m. The funeral was supposed to start at 10. I could see through the glass doors that people were still milling around the lobby, signing the guest book, that kind of thing. The second I opened the door, I saw Mom. She was talking to one of Grandma's church friends, and her whole body went rigid when she spotted me. She said something quick to the church lady and then came straight at me. She grabbed my arm and pulled me to the side, over by the coat rack area. She was trying to smile, but her jaw was clenched. She asked what I was doing here, keeping her voice low enough that people nearby couldn't hear. I told her I was attending my grandmother's funeral. She said we'd talked about this. I'd agreed to stay away. I definitely had not agreed to anything. I reminded her that she'd uninvited me, demanded $40,000, and then showed up screaming outside my apartment at 2 a.m. None of that counted as an agreement. She switched tactics, started saying how I'd already caused enough damage, how everyone was talking about our family drama, how I needed to think about what was best for everyone. I asked her if she'd thought about what was best for me when she told me I was too embarrassing to acknowledge. Dad came over then. He was doing that thing where he smiles for everyone watching, but speaks through his teeth. He said I needed to leave immediately, or he'd have me removed. I asked who was going to remove me. Him. The funeral director. I was a family member attending a funeral. I had every right to be there. That's when Declan appeared with Piper. She looked uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be part of this. Declan, though, he was angry. He said I was being selfish and making everything about me when it should be about Grandma. I pointed out that I wasn't the one who uninvited a family member and tried to extort money. That was all them. Piper actually spoke up. She said maybe they should all just go inside and get through the service. Declan told her to stay out of it. She looked hurt, but backed off. More people were starting to notice the commotion. I could see Aunt Carrie watching from across the lobby. Cousin Russell was pretending not to see us. Some of Grandma's friends were definitely staring. The funeral director came over and asked if everything was all right. Mom immediately put on her sweet voice and said yes, just some family discussions. The director looked at me and asked if I was family. I said, yes, grandson. He nodded and walked away. That made Dad even angrier. He said I was humiliating them, that I'd already destroyed their... My family just stood there, looking at me. Mom said one more time that I should leave, that it would be better for everyone. I told her I wasn't leaving, and I walked toward the chapel. They followed me. What else could they do? Make a bigger scene? The chapel was set up with rows of chairs. Grandma's casket was at the front, closed, with flowers all around it. I found a seat in the third row. My family sat in the front row, which was reserved for immediate family. The exact row where I should have been sitting if they hadn't uninvited me. The service started. The pastor talked about Grandma's life, her faith, her kindness. Different people got up to share memories. Aunt Carrie spoke about growing up with Grandma as their mother. One of Grandma's bridge club friends shared a funny story about a card game. Then they invited family members to speak. Dad got up and talked about what a wonderful mother-in-law Grandma had been. Declan shared a memory from when he was a kid. Zaria read a poem. Nobody invited me to speak. Nobody acknowledged I was there. When the family sharing portion ended, the pastor said we'd move to the burial portion at the cemetery. He mentioned that the pallbearers should come forward. 6 men stood up. Uncle Ralph, Cousin Russell, Declan, and 3 of Grandma's church friends. I'd been replaced as a pallbearer. I knew this already, but seeing Russell stand up where I should have been standing made it real in a different way. We all filed out to cars for the processional to the cemetery. Mom tried to position herself so I couldn't get near the family cars. I just walked to my Camry and followed the line of vehicles. At the cemetery, they had a canopy set up over the grave site with chairs underneath for family. Again, front row for immediate family. I stood in the back with some of Grandma's more distant friends and neighbors. The burial service was short. More prayers. It's been 3 weeks since the funeral, and I'm writing this update because people on Trust Test Hub keep asking what happened. The short answer is a lot. The longer answer is complicated and messy and honestly still unfolding. So, picking up from where I left off, that afternoon after the funeral, the thing I didn't see coming was Piper breaking up with Declan. She didn't call to tell me directly, but Zaria did. Zaria was furious, saying I'd ruined Declan's relationship by poisoning Piper against the family. According to her, Piper had told Declan she couldn't marry into a family that would treat their own son that way, and that she couldn't trust what he told her about anything since he'd completely lied about the funeral situation. I pointed out that I hadn't poisoned anyone. I just told Piper the truth when she asked. Zaria said that was exactly the problem, that I should have kept family business private. I asked her if she even heard herself, if she understood that lying to your fiancé about major family dysfunction was probably not a great foundation for marriage. She hung up on me. Declan called me an hour later. This conversation was different from the others. He wasn't yelling. He sounded tired. He said Piper had left and wasn't answering his calls. He asked if I was happy now that I'd destroyed his relationship. I told him I didn't destroy anything. He'd lied to his fiancée, and she'd found out. That was on him, not me. He got quiet and then asked why I couldn't just let it go. Why I had to make such a big deal out of everything. That question made me realize something. In Declan's mind, being uninvited from Grandma's funeral was just a small thing I should have gotten over. The years of being treated like I didn't matter were just family dynamics I should have accepted. The constant comparisons and put-downs were normal sibling stuff. He genuinely didn't understand why any of it bothered me. I asked him if he remembered my college graduation. I'd invited the whole family. Mom and Dad didn't come because they were embarrassed. I was only getting an associate's degree before I dropped out. He and Zaria came, but left right after the ceremony because they had dinner plans. I'd stood there in my cap and gown, watching other families take photos and celebrate, while mine couldn't be bothered. He said he didn't really remember that. It was years ago. I told him that was the whole problem right there. Things that didn't matter to him mattered to me. Being excluded, being lied about, being treated as less than because of my job. All of it added up over years into one message. I wasn't good enough for this family. He said I was being too sensitive, that everyone has family issues, and I was acting like ours were worse than they actually were. I asked him if he'd be okay with being uninvited from a funeral and having his childhood belongings donated without permission. He said that was different because he'd never put the family in a position where they'd have to do something like that. There it was, the core belief that I'd brought all of this on myself by not living up to their standards. I told him we didn't have anything else to talk about and ended the call. The next few days were strange. More family members were reaching out, some apologizing, some defending my parents, some just trying to understand what had happened. The family was splitting into camps, and everyone wanted me to know which side they were on. Uncle Ralph and his wife invited me to dinner at their house. Just me, not my parents or siblings. We sat in their dining room, and they apologized for not standing up for me sooner. Ralph said he'd known for years that my parents treated me differently, but he'd always told himself it wasn't his place to interfere. His wife asked if I was doing okay financially. I assured her I was fine. She looked relieved and said they'd been worried because of some things my mother had said about me barely getting by. I told her my mother didn't actually know anything about my financial situation. That's when Ralph said something interesting. He mentioned that he'd lent my parents money last year for some home repairs, over $10,000. They'd promised to pay him back within 6 months, but kept making excuses. He'd been frustrated about it, but didn't want to cause family drama. I asked if he knew about their other debts. He didn't. So, I told him what I'd pieced together. The refinanced mortgage, the country club dues they could barely afford, the lifestyle they maintained for appearances. He looked troubled and said he was starting to understand some things. On Thursday, 5 days after the funeral, my parents showed up at my apartment, not at 2 a.m. this time. It was 6 p.m., and they knocked instead of screaming. I let them in because my roommate Ralph was home, and I didn't want another scene in the parking lot. They sat on my couch, looking around my apartment like they'd never seen where I lived before. They hadn't. They'd never visited. Mom started talking. She said they'd been doing a lot of thinking, that maybe they'd handled things wrong with the funeral. She didn't say they were sorry, just that maybe they'd handled it wrong. Dad said the family was falling apart, and people were taking sides, and it needed to stop. He said I needed to tell everyone that we'd resolved our issues and things were fine now. I asked what exactly we'd resolved. Mom said we were talking now, weren't we? That was a start. I said a start to what? They still hadn't apologized. They still hadn't acknowledged that uninviting me from the funeral was cruel. They still hadn't explained why they lied about the funeral costs and tried to extort $40,000 from me. Dad got defensive. He said they never tried to extort me. They just told me what things cost. I pointed out that the funeral was $12,000, not $40,000. He said there were other expenses I didn't understand. I asked him to explain these other expenses. He couldn't. He just said I was twisting things and making them look bad. Mom jumped in and said this was exactly the problem. I was always so focused on being right instead of just being family. She said families forgive each other and move on. That's what you do. I asked her what I was supposed to forgive them for if they weren't admitting they did anything wrong. She looked frustrated and said I was being difficult on purpose. We went in circles like this for maybe 40 minutes. They wanted me to publicly say we'd reconciled, so the family drama would stop and their reputation could recover. I wanted an actual apology and acknowledgement of how they'd treated me. Neither side was budging. Finally, Dad said they'd cut me off completely if I didn't cooperate. No more family events, no more contact. I'd be dead to them. I pointed out that they'd already uninvited me from family events and tried to pay me to stay away, so that wasn't exactly a threat. Mom started crying. Real tears this time. She said she didn't understand how we'd gotten here, how I could be so cold to my own parents. I told her I'd learned from the best, and they should leave. They left. I haven't heard from them since, but I've heard from other people. Aunt Carrie called to tell me that she and several other family members had confronted my parents about the money situation. Turns out the $40,000 demand wasn't just about me. They'd been asking other family members for money, too. Always with different excuses. The funeral costs, home repairs, medical bills. Uncle Ralph confirmed he wasn't the only one who'd lent them money they hadn't paid back. Cousin Morgan had given them $5,000 last year. Another uncle had given them $8,000. The family's image of my successful, well-off parents was cracking. People were starting to realize that the country club membership and new cars were funded by debt and borrowed money. And the thing is, I didn't have to expose any of that. They did it themselves by trying to squeeze money out of everyone around them. Declan called me again last week. Piper still wasn't talking to him. He blamed me, but he also sounded like he was starting to question some things. He asked me if what people were saying about Mom and Dad's finances was true. I told him he should ask them directly. He said he had. They'd told him everyone was lying and exaggerating, but then he'd talked to Uncle Ralph and seen actual text messages asking for money. He didn't know what to believe. I told him he could believe whatever he wanted, but maybe he should ask himself why so many people were suddenly comfortable sharing these stories now. Maybe because they'd all been told to keep quiet for years to protect the family image, and now that image had been destroyed. Anyway, Zaria hasn't called. According to Aunt Carrie, she's still fully on my parents' side and telling anyone who will listen that I'm tearing the family apart out of spite. As for me, I'm actually doing okay. Better than okay, honestly. I picked up more delivery shifts, and I'm on track to save more this year than I ever have before. My roommates and I are planning to upgrade to a bigger place next month. I'm even thinking about taking some online courses. Not because I need to prove anything to my family, but because I actually want to learn some new skills. The family group chat that I was removed from months ago has apparently dissolved into arguments. People are splitting off into smaller groups. Uncle Ralph started a new chat without my parents or siblings in it and added me. About half the extended family is in it. Some of you in the comments at Trust Test Hub asked if I regret going to the funeral or exposing what my parents did. Honestly, no, I don't. They spent years making me feel worthless because I deliver pizza instead of being a lawyer or doctor. They lied about me to protect their image. They tried to erase me from my own grandmother's funeral. All I did was stop protecting their lies. Everything that happened after that was just consequences of their own choices. Would things be easier if I'd stayed quiet and let them exclude me? Maybe. But I'd still be that person they were ashamed of. Still be the family secret they had to hide. At least now I know exactly where I stand. And yeah, it hurts. It hurts that my parents chose their image over their son. It hurts that Declan and Zaria still don't see anything wrong with how I was treated. It hurts that I'll probably never have a normal relationship with them again. But what hurt more was spending years accepting treatment that made me feel like nothing I did would ever be enough. That hurt was slow and constant, and it was killing who I was as a person. This hurt is sharp and clean. This hurt comes from standing up for myself, and I can live with that. Some family members are suggesting we all get together and talk things out. I'm not interested. I've said what I needed to say. If my parents want a relationship with me, they know what it'll take. A real apology, actual acknowledgement of what they did, and proof through actions. Not just words. That things would be different. I'm not holding my breath. In the meantime, I'm just living my life, delivering pizza, saving money, spending time with people who actually value me, building something that's mine. My family called me an embarrassment. Turns out, the only embarrassing thing was how they treated me.